Okay, the time has come for quiz number 2. So let's spend a little bit of time reviewing the materials that we have covered since the last quiz, because the first thing I want to stress to you is that this is not a cumulative quiz since the beginning of the semester. The only materials that this quiz covers are those from modules 7 through 10. So don't stress about everything that was covered previously, just since the last quiz. All right. Within Module 7, we were focusing on the topics of sickness, aging, and dying. We didn't focus too explicitly on the first course concept that you see listed there, but that is something that's come out in modules since then in terms of the dying process, the moment of death, how that is experienced within different cultures or religions, also the sorts of near-death experiences that have been documented, and the surprisingly strange amount of consistency there is in those accounts. In terms of legal aspects of death and ethical bias, we watched the movie Being Mortal to get a sense of, conversations around end of life and medical treatment and palliative care that people can engage in terms of making those decisions for themselves. When we were discussing how aging and the elderly are perceived cross-culturally, this was also a different film we watched about aging in Tunisia, so the elderly population there, as well as some Tunisians who have emigrated to France and are living there. In the exercise or activity for that week, you were comparing, Tunisia to the US in terms of attitudes towards the elderly and elderly care. We saw that it's considered much more of a cultural burden or obligation within Tunisian society than it is here in the States. We tend to more, outsource elderly care here in the US than they do there. This also relates into, dealing with sickness and death cross-culturally. We talked about, in one of the lectures, the comparison of 2 cases dealing with infant mortality. If you recall, there was some anthropological work done in Brazil as well as in Africa, and this was an interesting comparison because it showed us how women tended to kind of deal in different ways with infant death. In the Brazilian case, they didn't even really allow themselves to publicly grieve or mourn for them because they just tried to not even have much attachment to their children until they, were more likely to be surviving. Whereas the opposite was true in Africa. It was much more of a outward expression of grief, and would have been strange if Brazilians were dropped in there with this sort of stoic attitudes that they had towards the death of children. This last bullet point then, describing different types of death from social causes and their positive and negative social values. So this was the focus of one of the lectures that week. We talked a bit about military deaths, suicide, execution, as well as sati being a practice within Hinduism, a bit of a controversial practice in which women are perceived to either sacrifice themselves on the funeral pyre or at least lay with their dead husband for a period of time and then leave the funeral pyre. Anyway. In that week too, we talked about aging itself, the perceptions of it within Western societies, the different ways we define a person's age, so their social age, physiological age, and calendrical age or chronological age. Those all have different definitions. We see life as progressing through certain sorts of stages. The transition into aging, is much more medicalization that we see here in the States, although there are also positive aspects. You hopefully have saved enough that your economics are in good shape. You tend to spend more time with family and just can get more gratifying experiences from that stage of life as well. All right, in modules 8 and 9, we talked about the afterlife or what comes next from more cultural perspectives, and then within some of the major world religions in module 9. So you see a lot of the overlap, therefore, in the course competencies for those 2 modules. So gaining a historical perspective of the burial practices and funeral rites from various cultures around the world. In module 8, the chapter we read and one of the lectures focuses on several case studies looking at Native American perspectives, several tribes in Africa, including the Nuer and the Dinka tribes. We looked at Melanesia, India, Madagascar, as well as Roma Gypsy communities in Britain, and the Maori. These are all different cultures that have different sorts of beliefs about the afterlife that then obviously influence the funerary rituals themselves. We also watched some videos that week, one focusing on Day of the Dead practices within Mexico, and then the other being the Qingming Festival as an example of ancestor worship in Chinese society. Hopefully it was clear enough in the lecture and in the materials how those funerary rites reflect the beliefs or values of the different societies. I would expect you to be able to apply that sort of comparative framework to views of the afterlife. So what aspects of society are we seeing reflected in those practices or in those beliefs? In terms of social organization, worldview, ideology, that's going back to that comparative framework that we learned about previously. And again, in the videos, looking at different ways of ancestor worship being the more common practice outside of stricter major world religions, which was instead our focus in Module 9. So there, again, we are looking at comparing and contrasting views of the afterlife across the major world religions. So looking at Hinduism and Buddhism within Indian cultures, as well as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism as being the major world religions. We watched, with the help of our friend Morgan Freeman, we explored, different concepts with the major world religions there in the video on Beyond Death. He took us on a nice tour of the sacred places that are important to these cultures. I would review, your notes from that video before jumping into the quiz. This is a major typo. Explore the concept of a soul, not soil. So sorry about that. As well as the sort of spiritual and scientific evidence that we have for this. So within science, we consider this to be this idea of consciousness. As I mentioned earlier, there's strange amount of consistency in the sorts of near-death experiences, so the things people come back from, as well as what people experience when death is coming. There are a few different TED Talks that we watched that week dealing with those topics. Okay, and so then our final module was Module 10. And within that, we were focusing on shamanism and faith healing, as well as mortuary cannibalism. So the mortuary cannibalism was the Wari funerary ritual that we read the article about and you focused on for your activity that week. So in their culture and from their perspective, it's seen as an acceptable form of death because to them, burial in the ground is seen as just ultimately disrespectful. It's as if you're abandoning them and will never think about them again. Instead, they view, ingesting the flesh of their deceased not by, blood relations, but at least by a fenal kin members as an ultimate form of respect. It brings them, kind of carries them forward into new generations. When we look at it from the mourner's perspective, it also is viewed as a way to bring about that ancestor's transformation into one of the sacred animals that they hunt. So the end of their mourning period is when they actually go on a ritual hunt to find, one of these pigs or deer that they can bring back and provide sustenance for the community going forward. So in this way, it's seen as, the dead still having an effect on the living and continuing with them. So I would expect you, hint hint, to be able to apply those stages involved in the rite of passage to this particular case study. We also looked at a few different spiritual approaches to healing and aging. This is the Zambia Spirit Hospital video and then the faith healing video. I would expect you to be able to, describe what sort of similarities or differences you see in those spiritual practices, as well as, understand the role of the shaman in general in these sorts of societies. Okay, Well, that's it in terms of our very quick overview. If you have any other questions, go ahead and post them to the discussion board and I will be happy to answer them. Good luck studying.